Eleanor Rigby, died in the church and was buried along with her name. Nobody came. All the lonely people, where do they come from? I had heard that Beatles song countless of times, but it wasn't until I was at a talk on loneliness and aging that I really listened to those words. I want you to stop for a moment and pause and think of your neighbors, family, friends. It is almost certain that you yourself know your own Eleanor Rigby. My name's Catherine Donnelly, and I'm an occupational therapist and health services researcher. And I'm here to share a story with you about a man that I'll call Frank. I was working at the Queen's Family Health Team as an occupational therapist, and I received a referral to see Frank. He had a number of chronic conditions and was having difficulties doing some of his day-to-day activities. He was having trouble walking around his apartment. He was having trouble getting into the shower, making meals for himself. Frank lived alone in an apartment, and his wife had died a number of years ago. He absolutely loved to carve wood, and he had a whole room dedicated to his wood carvings. But money was also tight for Frank, and he often found he couldn't do the things that he wanted or needed to do. He had very few social connections. He knew the neighbor next to him. He had a nephew that was about an hour away, and that was really the only relative he had. He didn't have children. And that relative would come the odd time to take him to some health appointments or help him with some heavy lifting. Frank was both lonely and socially isolated. Loneliness is a feeling that we experience, and social isolation is the number of connections that we have. Loneliness. It's been called a global health issue, an epidemic. The U.S. has recently put out a paper identifying loneliness as the next public health crisis. We don't know the exact magnitude of the problem, but the numbers estimate that approximately 1 in 3 people are experiencing feelings of loneliness. Likely someone here in the room are feeling lonely in some sort of way. And we know that since the pandemic, feelings of loneliness have only increased. And in older adults, we know that older adults feel lonely in higher numbers and for longer periods of time. It is shocking, the impact of loneliness, and many of you might have heard this recent statistic. Well, it's not recent, but it's been in the news, that loneliness puts you at risk, or poor social connections put you at risk of an early death, the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Simply put, you actually can die of loneliness. And we know that older adults are living alone longer than ever. Longer and alone. And we know that's in part because the demographics are changing, but we also know the social fabric is also changing. People are born to connect. So when we think about social isolation, we think about solitary confinement. Literally is a form of punishment and torture. Just going to check my notes because my brain is slightly jet lagged. We know that loneliness impacts all ages, but we know that older adults, again, are more prone. And I'm here to share with you my research on loneliness as we age. Because in the same building that I saw Frank, I also saw Tilly. I also saw Jane. I also saw Manuel. And while each of them lived on their own separate floor, none of them knew each other. So I would go and see Jane on the first floor, Tilly on the second, and Manuel on the fifth. And then I would see Joan in a house by herself in a neighborhood with houses all filled with older people, that at once that neighborhood was filled with children. And so I knew each of them, but they didn't know each other. And as healthcare providers, one of the key foundations is that we maintain confidentiality. And so I couldn't actually connect them. And so I didn't have a way or an intervention that I could think of that could bring them together. So I continued to work with each of them on their own. I knew them, but they didn't know each other, even though they were living together. And so while we know quite a bit about describing and understanding the concept of loneliness, we know much less about what we can do as a society, as healthcare providers, as individuals to address loneliness. And so while we know loneliness shortens lives, we know that relationships can extend and are what matter. You might have heard that the longitudinal study on adult development by Harvard followed almost 300 men starting in 1938, one of the longest running studies, still going to this day. And what they found was that at age 50, men who were the most satisfied with their relationships were the healthiest at age 80. Relationships, when you nurture those, you're actually literally nurturing your own health. Frank wanted to live on his own. He wanted to age in place, is what we often say. He wanted social connections. But our society is typically focuses on the individual. So we think of programs that we create, we deliver programs for the person. We rarely think about supporting our neighborhoods and thinking about the collective. So while I worked with a team of other health providers, pharmacists, social workers, dietitians, we all worked with Frank individually, doing our best to what I say, treat the tipping point issues. So we were able to keep and support him in his home, but we didn't fundamentally address the core issues of loneliness and social isolation. I'm an associate professor at the School of Rehab and also teach in the Aging and Health program. And I was teaching a course called Evaluating Health-Related Programs for Older Adults. And one of the assignments that I created for the students is that they needed to spend the semester identifying a program in the community supporting older adults. And that year is reading through, and each year they have every 2 weeks, they submit another part of their assignment. And so over the course of the term, I got to learn about a program called Oasis Senior Supportive Living. And as I was reading about that program, all the pieces fell into place. And I immediately thought of Frank, because Oasis is about a program designed to address issues of loneliness. And it's designed to address issues of loneliness where people are living. And so myself and my colleague, Vince DePaul, who's not here today, but he and I are very close colleagues and have done this work collectively together. We reached out to Christine McMillan. And Christine McMillan was the founder of Oasis. And she, and together with older adults living in, and this is maybe a new term for everybody, naturally occurring retirement community, or a NORC, we affectionately called them. So older adults living in a NORC created this program. And what they designed was, again, for anyone who hasn't heard of a NORC is a geographical area that has a high proportion of older adults. So that might be, like I was mentioning earlier, a neighborhood that has aged over time, and you can think about your own neighborhoods that you live in. And so again, they grow and change, or it could be, for instance, an apartment building that older adults or older people naturally move to. It might be close to amenities, or maybe it's a building that people lived in and then again have grown old together. And NORCs are a great place for us to think about how to support older adults. Again, thinking about how to bring people together where they're living, but also how we think of bringing services into naturally or NORC programs. And so Oasis has 3 pillars. It's looking at nutrition, physical activity, and socialization, all done in groups where people are living. And so Christine went to our local health authority, and she was able to secure funding to hire an on-site coordinator. And that on-site coordinator enacts the programs that the older adults themselves want to host in their building. The foundations in terms of philosophy are empowerment and self-determination. So again, older adults know best what they want. And again, the on-site coordinator enacts. Sometimes they have programs that they themselves volunteer. Sometimes we bring outside programs into the building. And it's a collaboration with the landlord partners who are core to this. And we actually have one of our lovely landlord partners, 2 of them actually here today from the city of Vancouver and Brightside. We run programs here in Vancouver, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. And so Oasis is about a program to address loneliness. It's not a health program, but it has health outcomes. So my colleague Vince and I thought to ourselves, it had been working magically in one building in Kingston, Ontario. And we wanted to see, could we potentially look at spreading this to other buildings across the province? So we worked with the Oasis Board of Directors, and we went on, for anyone who applies for research funds, it took us a little bit of time, and we were eventually successful in 2018. And we were able to secure $1 million to expand to 6 new communities. We worked with our colleagues both at Western University and McMaster and started to think about how we could expand to different communities in Ontario. So we spent that summer meeting with all of the Oasis members in that original community, listening, learning, documenting all the key ingredients so that we could spread that program to the other communities. So one of the core pieces of Oasis, as I mentioned, were NORCs. So how do you identify NORCs? And this is where the idea of big data comes in. So we were able to use Canada Census data to identify small neighborhoods or geographical units, and we were able to use some of that socio-demographic data to understand where were those neighborhoods where older adults were living, and what were some of those socio-demographic criteria. So we mapped those out in Kingston, we mapped them out in London, and we mapped them out in Hamilton, and we were able to pinpoint buildings in those areas. And so we've since expanded that work, so we've had biostatistician working with us. And again, this is freely available public data. And we've since mapped the entire province of Ontario. And we've mapped them over 4 census years. So you can actually see how neighborhoods are changing in terms of demographics. And you can see pockets, again, where there's differences. We've also done that in Nova Scotia. And so the whole province, you can go on our website. And we've also mapped out British Columbia. So you can actually look in, when you leave today, you can go and check out your neighborhood, and you can check out the different census years to see how that's been evolving over time. Well, one of those neighborhoods was the neighborhood Frank lived in. And so we called up the landlord, cold called the landlord, and we do that, and we asked the landlord and explained what the Oasis program is. And we described it and asked if they would be interested. And they were. And what that meant is that they offer and donate free space, so the common space in a building. And we provide the funds to hire the on-site coordinator. So began our connection working with Frank. And so what we do in all of our buildings, and we've learned from these early lessons, we put up flyers, because the idea is to create a community where people are living. And so we literally put flyers, and we can still attest to how we do this to this day. Post flyers in the laundry room, by the mailboxes, put them under the doors, and we host a series of information sessions. Again, because it's for and by the older adults, it has to be something that they want. And so we describe the program, head planning, and with all events, like this one too, you think to yourself, if we build it, will they come? And so when we put up the flyers, we weren't sure how many people were going to be coming. More importantly, we weren't sure if Frank was going to arrive, for I wasn't, because again, I couldn't reach out for this specifically. But that first planning meeting, Frank, by then he was 90, and he came in and he was sitting on a walker. This was the original building here. He sat in the corner, for he didn't know anyone in his building other than his neighbor, and that was by name only. So over the course of that year, Frank developed a community. They decided their Oasis group, and every Oasis is slightly different, they wanted to have morning coffees and newspaper chats. So he would come 3 mornings a week, and once a week they had an art drop-in. And in that art drop-in, he brought his wood carvings, and he became a mentor to the other people in the building. And so, again, Frank had a community. And so even though by that time he was unable to drive, he had developed a community who was able to take him to places that he wanted, where he needed to go. For Oasis isn't about providing services to one person, for instance, dropping a meal off and having a person eat by themselves, or hosting an exercise program that someone goes to and then comes back by themselves. It's about building a community where they're living and offering services and programming in that place. By 2020, COVID had hit, as we can remember distinctly, and we were particularly worried about Frank. And so I had 2 occupational therapy students with me working on placement at that time, and they immediately created a list if people had wanted to be on it, to be on the calling list. And I remember our project manager at the time, Simone Parniak, who was incredible, and reached out to Frank and spent hours on the phone training him how to use Zoom. And he eventually got to use Zoom. Part of what we wanted to do was find out, could we spread Oasis to other sites, which we found we can, and I'll share a little bit more about where we are today. But we also wanted to do evaluation to find out what was the impact of Oasis on social connections, social isolation, health outcomes. We conducted a series, and we've been doing quite a bit of research, and I'll again talk a little bit about that today. We conducted some early interviews with Frank and people in his building and some of the other buildings that we were working with. And what we heard was 3 key themes. We heard that Oasis gave people something to do and someone to do it with. We heard from Louise that she looked forward to Monday mornings because it gave her a reason to get out of bed and something to do so she didn't have to stay in her house alone. We heard from people that it helped them cope with life a little bit better. It gave them something to get up in the morning for. And over again, we heard that Oasis strengthened and deepened connections. We heard that people felt like Oasis was like a family to them. And for Frank, Oasis became like a family to him that he didn't have. And shortly after the pandemic, Frank was hospitalized briefly, not for COVID, for his other health conditions. And up until the day he passed away in the hospital, he was receiving calls from the Oasis members. Frank died in the hospital, but having lived at home just as he would wanted to. And like Frank, most older people want to age in place and want to stay at home until they pass away. We also wanted to see if Oasis could do that. So we have also been looking at some of our data and some of our outcomes to see if Oasis can extend people living at home. We've been able to use large data, large health administrative data. It's something in Ontario called ICS. And what it does is we can able to track people's use of the healthcare system. And what we found is that older people who were living in the original Oasis building, who eventually went to long-term care, were able to live in their home for a median of 1 year longer than people who were matched living in buildings without an Oasis program. We also found that people in an Oasis program had fewer hospitalizations, fewer emergency department visits, and almost 50% use of home care. So not only, again, are people feeling less lonely and more connected, they're actually developing networks that help each other. We've been very fortunate, so we've been continuing to do that research, and these are just some of our preliminary findings. We're just finishing a 5-year longitudinal study funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, where we're looking at members who are in Oasis buildings and comparing matched sites and following them longitudinally over time, looking at how their networks grow and change, looking at how they use healthcare differently, and a number of different health outcomes. So what started as one building in Kingston with about 50 members is now up to over 23 communities and growing. So we have Oasis communities in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, Dartmouth. We have in Ontario, some are growing in Alberta, and we've got 4 Oasis communities here in Vancouver, working with Brightside in the city of Vancouver. We also work with our community partners, the Collingwood Neighbourhood House here and West End Seniors Network. We have received over $10 million in funding to spread Oasis and to evaluate it, and we're in the midst of creating an Oasis not-for-profit, a national not-for-profit that will be populated and supported by the members themselves. I always feel funny standing up talking about Oasis social connections by myself here, because it would be disingenuous for me to say on my own that I have done this, and I am remotely just here as a representative of the incredible network of partners that we have, landlord partners, service partners, and the strength of the older adults. It's one of those lifetime projects that you only hope to achieve and be able to see the impact of the work of the collective, truly the collective. We think of the city of Vancouver, and I just want to also have a nod here. Again, the strategic framework in terms of thinking about older persons, and one of the key focuses is on loneliness and social connections. And so again, when I think about the city of Vancouver, I think of the incredible work that's being done to support older people here. We started this talk by thinking of Eleanor Rigby, and I got you to think about your neighbor, maybe yourself, family. I'm going to get you to think of each of those people as you leave here today. And again, there is no magic bullet to fix the feeling of loneliness, but each of us collectively can think about how we might reach out as we leave here today to think about your own Eleanor Rigby. Thank you very much.